So welcome everyone. So I hope you're all here for session 6B, Visual and Audio in Taiwan Media. I'm Chen, and I work with the Taiwan Studies Program here. I'm also a PhD candidate in Cinema Media Studies at the University of Washington. So I'm very happy to be having this wonderful conversation with you all, thinking about the audiovisual landscape of Taiwan. So our presenters today will take us through an audiovisual journey that spans across like 70 years. And then we will visit sites of production, receptions, and also circulation, and as well and cross-cultural exchanges as well, sensorially. So I really look forward to all the conversation we will have. So let me welcome our first presenter, Xie Peijun Viola Xie. Who is also a PhD candidate in Department of Art History at the SUNY Binghamton University. And then she was also a fellow at the Independent Study Program at the Whitney Museum of American Arts. So let's welcome her to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. And first of all, I want to thank Evelyn for your generous introduction, and thanks for everyone for coming. And today, the paper I'm going to presenting is from part of my dissertation chapter. And I'm going to, since for the sake of time, I'm going to do a very old school art historian way of like delivering my paper. So I'm going to read. So the title of today's paper is called Aural Resilience, Sonic Labor in Chen Ting-jung's You Are the Only One I Care About Whisper. Upon initially encountering Chen Ting-jung's You Are the Only One I Care About Whisper, I expected to experience a massive sonorous immersion, given its monumentality of this sound of installation. So given its monumentality of this sound installation, a giant wall mounted with 17 loudspeakers. However, the artwork turned out to be almost inaudible. The quietness drew me in, prompting me to step closer and walk around its wavy wall in the search of the source of the faint sound. Slowly, a long note emanating from the back of the installation became perceivable, like the whisper of the work's title. A contralto called out in a low tone, with the soprano responding in a shrill voice. These two female vocalists were singing in an a cappella reinterpretation of You Are the Only One I Care About, an all too famous song from late 70s by Taiwanese culture icon Teresa Deng. Not only were their voice at art with the cold industrial material of the sound wall and the modernist glass gallery, their neutral vocal delivery jarred with my memory. The singer's vocalization was nothing like Teresa Deng's characteristic intimate and soft voice. Drawing on the sonic rivalry across the Taiwan Strait between Kuomintang regime and the Chinese Communist Party from the 1960s through the 1980s, You Are the Only One is not mildly a ghostly invocation of a historical icon, but an intervention into the operation of the female voice as a tool of psychological warfare employed by the Kuomintang regime during the Cold War. Indeed, the Beisan broadcast wall, rising like a prosperous mountain sculpture on the cliff above the coast of Guningtou, Jingmen, only 1.2 miles away from Xiamen, China, was built in 1967 as part of a larger system of Cold War sonic circuitry. The Beisan broadcast wall is a four-story concrete structure systematically punctuated with 48 portholes, each of which contained a powerful loudspeaker. In contrast to three other similar broadcast devices located in low bunkers, Beisan broadcast wall stands tall. It engaged with high-volume, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week sonic confrontation, blaring propaganda like slogan shouting and popular music, particularly Teresa Deng's folky love songs. Song installation, particularly ones that employ the female voice, has been Chen's forte for the past 10 years of her artistic career. Her artistic practice often contrasts wartime acoustic architecture with contemporary forms of sonic transmission and distribution, exploring how material conditions then and now shape the cultural practices. In You Are the Only One, it is as if the artist has thought to soften the formidable military stronghold and to reclaim the wartime operationalizing of the female voice. In Chen's imagination, it is as if the original structure of Beisan broadcast wall were turned down into its fundamental cubic unit, with its individual loudspeakers no longer punched into the concrete wall aperture, but rather free to reassemble. She then transformed the grid of the original Beisan broadcast wall into a horizontal arc that is less than 6 feet high and that envelopes the audience in its indurating wave. Further alteration include reducing the number of speakers from 48 to 17, and rendering each trumpet-like loudspeaker more prominently visible. From distance, the corners of the speakers appear to be made of concrete. Yet as one gets closer, one discovers them to be a product of Chen's intensive hand labor. Indeed, they are papier-mâché foam made from the flyers and newspaper collected by Chen from the street of Vienna. The recomposed female voice is relayed through these 17 papier-mâché trumpets. How and why Chen came to reclaim Beijing broadcast war is the story I want to explore here, where the questions about exploitation of the female labor and the aestheticization of the female voice confront with the orality of the Cold War. I argue that female voice became a specific silo production during the Sonic combat between Kuomintang regime, KNT, and People's Republic of China, PRC, and suggests that this operational female voice represents the crux of Chen's artistic intervention to the weaponizing female voice. By a close examination into Chen's sound installation, You Are the Only One, I attempt to trace the work's convergence with the history of sonic labor, a gender-segregated labor and sensitivity that further migrate beyond the war zone to its recurrence in the neoliberal present. Most importantly, it invests how Chen's intervention is both a feminist critique to the gendered labor and a form of sonic resilience that open up different political possibilities of listening. Soft sonority. If Beijing broadcast war aims to disseminate the female voice via military-grade sound system, Chen's replicate sound wall, a low-fi, low-take assemblage that can only speak in scattered voices, operates at the other extreme. Female voices here are not amplified for political propaganda or sonic dominance. On the contrary, their discordant singing, whisper voices are searching and welcoming for echo or off-tune humming from the audience. Chen's repurposing the female voice is reinforced by her reconfiguration of the original physical structure. The two installations thus produce radical differences auditory environments. On the one hand, an overwhelming, totalizing, unifying experience, while on the other, an interwoven network of whispers between papier-mâché cubes. The almost indiscernible whisper of Chen's installation draws the curious audience closer to the cubes, inviting envelopment. Chen's array of boxes constitute an obvious homage to the minimalism emphasis on the audience bodily interaction. As in Robert Morris's box with the sound of its own making, Morris's work appears at first to like any other ordinary wooden box, except for the fact that Morris has hidden an audio speaker inside of it. The periodical sound of hammering, sewing, and sanding, namely 3-hour-long recording of Morris's wooden box making process, are amplified and resonate through and within the cube. In the absence of the maker or any visualization of his endeavor, this audio process of woodworking renders the work as self-referential aesthetic object. This handcrafted minimalist work strips the rhetorical content away, and only conceptual notion of the so-called wooden box making process remains. The relationship between You Are the Only One and box should be understood in terms of its self-reflexivity with the regard of process of making, i.e. labor of the cube making, rather than as a direct borrowing of the minimalist sculptural aesthetics. As our historian Julian Bryan Wilson has incisively noted, the box represents Morris's attempt to postulate the notion of labor vis-a-vis the making of simple cube. Despite the fact that the labor here is not a visual presentation but an oral one. Compared to his larger project, such as Untitled, in his notorious Whitney show of 1970s, the labor involved in the making of box is personal and intimate. From the small wood knot box to a big mass of timber, what is made public are both the scale of the works and the intensity of the labor. Here, the tension does not lie in the body of the spectator in relation to the scale of the work, that oftentimes falls between monument and ornaments, but in the evaluation of artist's labor. Though Morris' physical work is not only audible in the work of Box, in his Whitney show, his labor leaps into a visibility by means of the work's elaborated construction. In contrast to Morris' nostalgic nod to the physicality and masculinity of manual labor, Chen Chen's papier-mâché wall appeared to be soft and permeable. In You Are the Only One, the iterable handmade foam do not presuppose the masculine power necessary. Instead of Morris's butcher physicality, what is made visible in Chen's artistic labor is repetitive resilience. Through both of her choice of material, papers, and flexible steel sheets, and her means of making, grinding, gluing, molding, and binding, the result emphasis on plasticity and pliability, always free to be reshaped and reformed. The formal notion of resilience, the plasticity of the shape, and malleability of the substance is only possible through her repetitive handcraft, which is traditionally be considered as a domestic and female form of labor. For these reasons, Chen's reclaiming of Beishan broadcast wall is more than simply a satire to a letter's modernist concrete structure and its attendant co-war sonic network. Rather, it is both a plastic reimagination of form and a commentary on the feminine sensibility that has been historically associated with the sound since the emergence of the sonic combat. For the KNT government, the soft sonority and delicate sensibility of the female voice seem to bridge two contradictory ideology. The US-led capitalist KNT government and the PRC, resulting in a continuous communicational strategy. The female voice cuts across the political form of labor and aesthetic sensibility. Voice as our holy property is like a national trademark. The former female broadcaster Xu Yanxue knows her enemy. With her radio booth located a mere 25 kilometers away from communists in Xiamen, she was very sensible to the sonic differences between KNT and the PRC, namely the former's decade sound versus the latter's sound of metal. Having grown up right alongside the area for sonic contestation, her career as a broadcaster in a war zone matured hand in hand with the KNT's operationalization of the female voice. Despite the struggling to claim sonic dominance over the strait with its comparable low-tech sound system, the KNT government found unexpected compensation in the utility of female voice. When the first radio station launched in Guishan, the military recruited a large number of single young women, aged between 18 and 25, who possessed clear enunciation, sweet voice, and suitable political sympathies as a broadcaster on the front line in charge of daily radio program and propaganda. These women were trained to mediate between KNT regime and communists, with 3 shifts a day for 2 different vectors of communication: slogan shouting via broadcast wall and announcement via wireless radio transmission. Each announcer's soothing voice was coupled with an intimate one-on-one conversational style. Chen Jiping, a Chinese communist student of Xiamen University in the 1970s, recalled agonizing experiences of listening to the greetings from the enemies. Quote, "At beginning, we were in pain simply hearing it," Teresa Dun's songs, including the broadcaster's voice. "We feel that it's bad and vicious. But now I find that the voice of North Korean broadcasters are weird too. I cannot bear it. And the truth is that we, the Chinese communists, sound exactly like them." End of quote. What repelled Chen in the 70s was the soft and sweet conversational style, the KNT semantic order and sonic expression, that marked the different forms of vocal expression between communists and USA capitalists. This transformation of his oral tolerance, rather than signifying the elevation of political struggle across Taiwan Strait since the late 1980s, demonstrate a force of historically imprinted voice and its sensibility, where the broadcaster's innocuous voice enabled a great level of discomfort and even affliction to the Chinese communists, namely a psychological warfare crafted by the KNT but only possible through the PRC's sonic regulation of its political authority. By regulating a specific sonic persona, a single young woman with a sweet and clear vocal delivery, the KNT regime established a gender-segregated form of labor. Its sonic ubiquity did not lie in the shouty slogan in a communal area, but rather in the conversational, intimate, and semi-bourgeois style of speaking that blurred the distinction between public soundscape and private sonic imagination. Arching horizontally across the floor of a gallery, Chen's wall of sound is an invitation to articulate a different political possibility for the female voice. Intensive and repetitive physical labor that pays homage to the gender segregate work of the young KNT broadcasters of the past, in the plastic and perforated structure of the wall, and in the discordance a cappella recording. Chen reclaims Beisan broadcast wall, but imbued with intimacy and sense of oral resilience. As Chen's wall is designed to be palatable, its cube and papier-mâché loudspeaker free to reassemble. The singing voice welcome any offhand of key humming from the audience. In the place of a highly regulated instrumentalized female voice, whether in the tradition of the PRC or the KNT, Chen offers an open broadcast, one with a space and erratic delays, pause, and different rhythm or breathe. What Chen reclaims here then is that the past has not yet become a history, but it whispers. A soft sonority operates across our private and public sphere, and ubiquitous and yet imperceivable female voice traveling from the frontline to our everyday sensibilities. Taking a cue from this history of instrumentalizing female voice, nevertheless, Chen manifests an alternative sound wall imbued with a form of resilience. Exonerate from the fate of the ideological surrogacy, the breathing tone is now liberated from a fantastic array of creative possibility. 30 years after the halt of the sonic combat between KNT and PRC, Chen's You Are the Only One is both an expose of history of political use of female voice and the invitation for oral resilience that is yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedrin, for the wonderful presentation. So our next presenter is Liu Yilin Liu, and he's a PhD candidate at the media school at Indiana University. So let's welcome him.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ellen, for her introduction. I want to thank all the organization for their hard work to put on this event. I'm Yilin. I'm from Indiana University, Bloomington, and the presentation I have today is part of my dissertation. So any feedback and critique is welcome. So let me begin my presentation. So Italian neorealism is one of the most important film style emerged after the World War II. In the early film scholarship and critical writing, this style is being interpreted as the anti-fascist struggle of the Italian people and in an inspiring exploration of the cinematic medium. Since the 1990s, scholars have been documenting and analyzing not only the historical condition of the emergence of this style, but also its global influences. Film scholar Saverio Giovacchini and Robert Scholar's edited volume, Global Neorealism, is the most recent and thorough efforts in thinking about the conditions and global dissemination of this Italian film style. Through documenting how different film cultures and governments receive and regulated neorealism, the volume highlights the issues of evaluation and interpretation of neorealist aesthetic globally. Italian neorealism also occupies an important place in Taiwanese film scholarship. It serves as the filmmaking model for both the authoritarian states and independent-minded filmmaker. And scholars have studied and argued how the authoritarian state appropriated neorealism and how this film style influenced New Taiwan cinema in the 80s. So in this presentation, I attempt to engage with these two inquiries. Regarding the Taiwanese film studies, this project wants to shift our focus from production to reception of films, contrasting to previous scholarship focusing on how a foreign film style influenced domestic film production. In this study, I want to look at how these films and ideas were received and appropriated in Taiwan. By including film reception and consumption into our discussion of national cinema, I want to show that any national cinema is always already heterogeneous and transnational. Furthermore, a film culture is more than about what films are produced, but also about the discursive framing of them. These framings constitute what film scholar Miriam Hansen called horizon of understanding, which is the crucial mediation between production and reception. Following Hansen's insight, To understand the development of film culture in Taiwan, we have to study the regulation and reception of foreign films. This, I contend, will help us to better understand how a film culture developed, and specifically how art films were discussed and interpreted in an authoritarian regime. Regarding the studies of global neorealism, I just noticed I messed up my slides. Regarding the studies of global neorealism, to which I would like to contribute a case study from East Asia, which is curiously underrepresented in Giovacchini scholars' impressive volume. Furthermore, I would like to suggest that concepts like evaluation and evaluation regime might put some of the common interests in global neorealism studies into sharper relief. I borrowed these terms from anthropologist Lily Chomley's. By evaluation, Chomley means the fact that, quote, social actors evaluate qualia, which are perceived qualities of things, and qualia are in turn used to evaluate social actors. So in the process, aesthetic judgments regarding sensuous experience come to be aligned with moral judgment about social personae. So her example is based on her fieldwork in art schools in China. So the art school teachers will evaluate students' work evaluate students' development as a person, as an artist, through evaluating their works. And there's this established framework and rules people need to negotiate. And evaluation regime, Chomley means, quote, practices in which the work of evaluation is routinized and invested with authority, end quote. So these concepts were helpful in thinking about the reception of neorealism, since movement of cultural objects implies evaluation and selection. As Giovacchini scholars have pointed out, that neorealism could be incorporated into filmmaking projects with different politics because, quote, nothing moves, is exported, or is accepted wholesale. The anthropological concept of evaluation and evaluation regimes push us to think about what experience qualities, as manifested in films or their discursive framings, are noticed by social actors who in turn will impose values onto these qualities and make moral or political judgments based on them. So conceptually, I see government censorship, advertising, and critical writing of films as different evaluation regimes. This presentation is a preliminary attempt to map out these regimes and try to describe the evaluation process. So I attempt to answer the following questions. How did different social actors use the term neorealism in authoritarian Taiwan? How did social actors evaluate neorealist films? What are the qualities they focus on? And lastly, what political and aesthetic possibilities are opened up by the term neorealism for filmmakers and critics in a non-Western country? So in the rest of the presentation, I will first discuss the government regulation of these films, the advertising of neorealist works in Taiwan, and how film critics interpreted this style. I argue that there is a divide between the critical and commercial/governmental discourses in Taiwan in this period. Although the label Italian neorealism had entered Taiwan's public discourse in the 50s, promotional and governmental discourses of cinema rarely use it. In fact, film distributors and governmental censors shared another framework to classify film genres: social education and wenyi, a term meaning Western arts, and was popular among the film literati during the Republican China period, were the two common labels for these Italian films. Additionally, the promotional discourse used rhetorics of imaginary geography, sensationalism, and wenyi to create value for these films. Across the divide, critics evaluated these films either in terms of national culture or as a mode of filmmaking that is suitable for an underdeveloped film industry. So according to Taiwanese film scholar Liao Jingfeng, several Italian neorealist films had appeared commercially in Taiwan in the 50s. Through consulting the Cultural Ministry archives, I was able to obtain censorship files of Bicycle Thieves, Bitter Rice, and The Woman of River. What is surprising for me is that, except in one instance, the government didn't censor any of these films. It is as if the supposedly political nature of the early neorealist films simply bypassed the KMT government. The only serious opinion from the censor I found regards the bicycle thieves. In the censorship files of that film, under the column "The Parts That Should Be Edited," the censors single out the scene where the father takes his son to a restaurant to have lunch. So this is the scene. You see this poor kid is eating sandwich, and there's another. The second shot is a rich family having a meal. So what troubled the censor was that this scene showed the stark contrast between the rich and the poor. Since the film censorship rules in the 50s didn't dictate that films should not depict the wealth gap between the haves and have-nots, it is rather difficult, at least for me, to determine the censor's reasoning behind the decisions. It is possible that they were afraid that the audiences of the film would observe the depiction of social classes in Italy and then transpose that to Taiwan. In other words, for the censors, the audiences were not passive consumers, but that they were active meaning creators, and it is this imaginative power that must be blocked. So what's happening inside the film is not the only place where censors could intervene. In some cases, the censors could have a say in how to translate the title of the film. In the case of Bicycle Thieves, the censors played a decisive role in giving the film its well-known Mandarin title among Taiwanese cinephiles. The film distributor who first submitted the film for review originally translated the Italian title Ladridi Biciclette as 自传车窃贼. This translation follows the Japanese translation of the film Jidensha Dolobo. Perhaps sensing this quality of Japaneseness of the submitted title, the censors suggest that in the report that the film could be retitled as 单车失窃记, which means the stolen bicycle story. I can't. Oh, sorry. So this is the part where they suggest that the title could be the film could be retitled as 单车失窃记instead. The censorship file can be seen as an interface between the state and the film distributors. Both social actors need a functional classification system to map out and organize the films that will be circulating in Taiwan. The result was that the state and distributors had to have a common language to classify these Italian works. The label neorealism was rarely used, and a more common label for these films were 文艺 or social education. It was through these labels that Italian neorealism were regulated and advertised in Taiwan. So these are different films and how they are categorized in different ways. So you have like romantic 文艺片 or romantic drama or 社教 or social educational drama for different films. When analyzing how US distributors advertise neorealist films, film scholar Nathaniel Brennan notices that the US distributors would often use two strategies to promote these films. On the one hand, they would emphasize the cultural value of these works. On the other, the US distributors would sometimes heighten the sexual or violent aspects of these films to attract audiences. In addition to these two value-creating strategies, advertisers in Taiwan also deploy a geography of value to promote Italian neorealist works, which indicates a double consciousness that is always evaluating oneself through a value system from the outside. So to boast the cultural prestiges of this film, distributors will either label these films as educational or associate them with the category of 文艺. These ads will claim that the viewers will learn what life and society really are through watching these films. Additionally, they will associate these movies with images connected with the prestigious cultural symbols from the US or the West, such as the Oscar statue or an ornate picture frame. So here you have the ad for Bicycle Thief, and you can see the prominent visual motif is the Oscar statue. And he claims that he won like 13 Oscars at the 1949, which is a lie. And another interesting thing is they always put this like beautiful picture frame at the middle to obviously associate this film with Western oil painting, high art, and so on. So another way to promote this film is through sex appeal. So for instance, the whole ad campaign for bitter rice, a melodrama of migrant female farmers in Italy, was centered on the physique of the supporting character played by Silvana Mangano. In addition to promoting neorealist films either as artistic or as sexy, Taiwanese distributors also mobilize a rhetoric of geography of value to frame these movies. This rhetoric can be seen as a framework through which the Taiwanese distributors make sense of the contemporary world cinema. In an ad for bicycle thieves on the left, at the bottom of the ad, we see it proclaiming that bicycle thieves outperform other foreign films box office-wise when it was shown in Japan. The ad, which is promoting the film for a theater in Taichung, also describes how audiences in Taipei crowded the theater when the film premiered there. These hyperbolic claims from the print ads, such as Bicycle Thieves won 13 awards in 1949, or Bitter Rice outperformed all other foreign films in Japan and America, were probably all false. But they shed light on the imaginary map and structure of value film distributors and theater owners in Taiwan used to make sense of the state of world cinema. Distributors might not know the aesthetic values of these films. However, they did assume that terms like the US, Japan, the Oscars, and other foreign markers indicate high cultural value. Moreover, circulation matters to them. Bicycle Thief is worth watching not only because it moves and educates its audiences, but also that the physical film print have played in a big cities in the US or in Japan. And the people there supposedly love it. These visual and discursive signs indicate that distributors and theaters owners believe that circulation creates value. The value, the worth watchingness of a film will increase if it has been played in big cities in the Cold War order created by the US. But for critics, neorealist films represented a resource for critiquing the domestic film industry. What is interesting about these film criticisms is that they don't follow the dichotomies between Eastern and Western cultures, or the distinction between neorealism or / art cinema versus Hollywood. For the critique Huang Ren, the mise-en-scène in some of the Italian neorealist films represents a mode of symbolic thinking one used to find in, quote, Eastern cultural works. After reviewing Gillo Pontecorvo's The Wild Blue Road, which is a very interesting political film, like promoting collectivism versus individualism. And based on Huang's review, it doesn't seem like the film was heavily censored by the government. So it's another interesting case how leftist politics film might pass the censorship. So Huang, after reviewing this film, Huang argues that Taiwanese filmmakers should learn from the Italians and to retrieve something that they have lost. For the film director Bai Ke, neorealism or realist aesthetics is not antithetical to Hollywood, but should be thought of as the system's immanent self-critique. So in this essay titled Neorealist Cinema, he doesn't really discuss stereotypical Italian neorealist film. Instead, he quotes two mainstream Hollywood directors and their critiques of Hollywood as being focusing too much on production value and special effects and so on. And Bai offers this aesthetics of content over form in this essay. So, well, just to conclude, I would like to highlight that these instances of neorealism in Taiwan reveal some of the assumptions that ground the evaluation regimes operating in Taiwan during this time. One of the key organizing principles is the idea of nation. The quality of a nation can be embodied linguistically or cinematically. Based on different evaluation regimes, a quality of a nation, say Japaneseness, can be either positive or negative. Furthermore, at least in the critical realm, the qualities of a nation are not mutually exclusive. One can find something uniquely Eastern in an Italian picture. It is as if the critics in the 50s has already anticipated the idea that the nation is always already transnational. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Eileen, for this wonderful revisit of the reception and also the framing of the reception of Italian neorealism in Taiwan. So our next speaker is Evelyn Shi. She is assistant professor at the Department of Asian Language and Civilizations at the University of Colorado Boulder. She will be joining us virtually.
Okay, so thank you to all the organizers, and I'm very happy to share my work in this panel. I think we have some common themes going on in terms of sound and film practices during the Cold War era. Okay, so I'll just hop right in. Okay, so post-synchronized sound has been a common practice since the beginning of cinema. In short, what it points to is the fact that sound is often recorded separately from the photographic image in the filmmaking process. I should say sound or talking cinema. The so-called sound film stitches the sound to the image in the editing process so that the sound appears to emanate from the image. Beyond dialogue, Foley art and digital effects are also commonly added to film sound in post-production, even to the present day. And environmental sound, which may be recorded at the time of filming, can be mixed in at more appropriate levels and timing for atmospheric dynamics. In short, a lot of technical work and artifice are behind producing one of the core illusions of sound film, that film sound comes directly from the film image, and by doing so draws the film viewer into an immersive spatial and temporal environment implied by these reverberations. Now the question is, why is so-called dubbing bad? Usually in popular discourse, when we refer to dubbing, we mean the opposite of direct sound. We mean that certain sounds give a strong impression of being artificially added after the fact. Something feels inorganic, something is too artificial and destroys the illusion of immersive space and time. There are two aspects of this negative feeling around dubbing that I'd like to point out here. First, as Marianne Doan argues in a classic essay on this subject, a strong sense of dubbing may inauthenticate the presence of actors on screen. She calls the assemblage of the human body visualized on film and its voice the phantasmatic body, a virtual presence that is constructed when image is married to sound. Second, as Michel Chion argues much later, the noticeable dubbing violates the principle of sonic naturalism, which is, quote, the dominant dogma in today's technical, cultural, social, and other practices. Sound is considered as a sort of given that maintains a relationship of identity with the milieu from which it originates that implies isomorphism, end quote. So for Chion, who pays much more attention to environmental sound and the nuances of Foley art, it is not just human figures that must be portrayed naturalistically, but the whole sonic world of the film. For both Doan and Chion, it is a problem when the gap between the time and space of image recording and the time and space of sound recording becomes imminently sensible to the audience. This is what Chion himself has famously called the acousmet. All film sound, in the end, must be acousmatic, but while we are watching, we'd like to believe that it isn't so. I want to emphasize in this presentation, which is specifically about film sound in Taiwan, that the expectations for the audiovisual illusion changed over time, and that the spread of film technologies bent to this purpose were uneven across world cinemas. In the 1970s, Hollywood film sound went through a major shift, which involved the adoption of the Dolby noise reduction system and Dolby theater speaker technology. Together, these innovations allowed the creation of much more complex sound mixing so that the sound designers could add more sound elements to create a more naturalistic sound. Chion's sonic naturalism became a dominant dogma during this time. However, Taiwan cinema did not make this shift into naturalistic sound until much later. As journalist Huang Zhongda noted, currently, most national films are still using the backward system, the 落后的 system of post-synchronized dubbing, 事后配音, to provide dialogue and sound effects, which is only used in the Euro-American film scene when dubbing foreign films into local language. This technology has an inherent flaw, which is that it is very difficult to match the actor's sound expression and facial expressions, and careful viewers will discover that the film has no verisimilitude and lacks a lively persuasiveness. Huang based his observations on his film-going experiences during his time studying and working abroad in the United States. So dubbing became a bad object in Taiwanese cinema at this time precisely because of the growing gap between film sound in European and American films and film sound in Taiwan. In other words, it was a sense of belatedness that came from the comparison of foreign and domestic film, both of which were available in theaters. Taiwanese post-synchronization fell behind that of Euro-American cinema in the 1970s because it did not have the benefit of Dolby's noise reduction system. And without that technology, it was not possible to mix as many tracks in any given segment of film, which made the soundscape more simplistic, even if it could be fairly clear and precise when it came to dialogue. In the area of aesthetics, critics railed against the shortfalls of Taiwan cinema and its equally dub-happy Hong Kong counterparts when it came to creating believable phantasmatic bodies and sonic realism. And sonic realism, incidentally, became more and more of an important value with the rise of documentary-style realism in the Taiwan New Wave, or in neorealist works, to reference the last presentation, right? So we have a sort of split between a sort of technological belatedness and also a kind of falling behind in terms of aesthetic achievement. So I'm going to start talking more specifically about what it is that was desirable, that was sought after both technology and aesthetic for filmmakers in the 1980s, right? And in particular, what was relevant to the Taiwan New Wave filmmakers. 1989's City of Sadness is commonly touted as the first film in Taiwan to feature simultaneously recorded on-site sound, or as you can see there, I've put 现场同步录音. Here you see Hou Xiaoxian and his sound designer and engineer, Du Duzhi. According to oral histories and interviews, Du breaks with the philosophy of previous Zhongying or CMPC sound designers who sought clean sound. That is, they wanted a simple and elegant design instead of a more complex naturalistic one. The unity of a simplistic design trumped the nuance of a noisy naturalistic one in their minds. And Du's insistence on recording sound on site, despite its difficulty and high failure rate, can be traced back to his belief that in an immersive sonic realism, and not necessarily always a clear one, as anyone who has watched City of Sadness may recall. It's not the easiest film to follow if you just listen to it. So in this image, we see Du Duzhi and his sound crew recording on site for City of Sadness, braving the elements at a short distance from filming. But the ideals of on-site recording were often quite distant from the realities of how sound could be captured and used during editing. The ideals, of course, are that, number one, environmental sound gives a sense of place. Number two, on-site recording enables actors to do spontaneous ad-libs and improvisation. And number three, the materiality of spaces and actors' voices become tangible through layers of sound. The presence of the sound recording engineers on site gives the sound, and not just the image, an indexical magnetism. The environmental sound firmly locates the events of the film spatially in Taiwan, as is the non-professional and improvisational acting of Li Tianlu and some of the other actors. Even the meticulously designed point of audition moments when the audience follows the deaf character of Wenqing, or the tense dialogue with three languages in the same conversation are designed in counterpoint with environmental sounds recorded on site and are careful to give a sense of the actor's bodily presence. But what are the realities of the on-site recording practice, which are still very much in their infancy at this time in the Taiwan film industry? First, the cameras used at the time made so much noise that the mechanical sounds were picked up by the recording equipment. So here is an image from the filming of Banana Paradise, directed in 1989, just like City of Sadness by Wang Tong, in which we see an attempt to tamp down the noise of the camera with a quilt. On top of this difficulty, it was not possible to record this on-site sound with the camera itself, obviously. not at a good enough quality to use. So they were using these relatively small cassette devices from Sony to capture the sound, and even so, it was not clear enough to use for the dialogue. According to editors at the time, the material recorded on site in this transitional period was often used as a reference and had to be supplemented with Foley art and re-recorded dialogue. So these two images are actually taken from the movie A Foley Artist, a documentary about Hu Dingyi, who is another, he's a Foley artist during this period of time. Beyond the difficulties of sound recording, sound mixing also stuck at an impasse because no studios in Taiwan had access to the Dolby noise reduction system. And this means, as I mentioned before, that even if they recorded copious amounts of on-site sound, the editor's hands were somewhat tied because only a limited number of tracks could be mixed before the entire soundscape became filled with a hiss of unwanted noise in the mixing process. So I have a slide here that I don't really have time to go through, but you can see Taiwan's adoption of Dolby was at least 10 to 15 years behind that in the US, right? And so what we see here is in the middle of this, Hou Xiaochen is making City of Sadness using these techniques of direct sound and on-site recording. However, this doesn't mean that Dolby has fully even arrived in Taiwan, because what's happening is the sound is recorded and then ultimately mixed in Japan, borrowing a studio, renting a studio that had the use of this noise reduction system. And only after this film came out, did theaters even begin to shift to this Dolby speaker system, so to get the full benefits of this newly created sound mixing. So the interesting thing is, even to the current day, a lot of sound mixing for Taiwanese films is done internationally, either in Japan or in Thailand, where it's more cost effective. There still isn't a lot of this just equipment and capability within the Taiwan film industry, which is very sad for sound engineers and mixers and designers in Taiwan. So at this point, I want to take a turn away from the confines of the Taiwan New Wave and its specific sound aesthetics, because in actuality, popular Taiwan cinema had a different set of standards, and I argue a different set of aesthetics. Instead of dwelling on the lack of access to sound technology, I want to ask the question, what if dubbing was good? And I will focus here on a particular area of my expertise, which is comedy film, or film comedy, and show how a meta-filmic interest in dubbing and the post-synchronization process presents a strong opportunity for a cinema of comic attraction. The film that I have chosen for this purpose is Upstairs, Downstairs of 1979, literally 楼上楼下. The central set piece of this film is a 4-story walk-up apartment building in which the Sanfang 录音室, the recording studio, Sanfang recording studio, makes its home. It's just embedded in there with other, just civilian homes. It's one apartment that has been refitted to be a sound studio. And this is based on the situation of the real Sanfang recording studio, which incidentally did the sound for this film. So it's a very kind of meta-commentary type of thing. The important thing to note here is that Sanfang is private and not housed within Zhongying, or the CMPC. And so private studios for both film and sound recording were kind of a new phenomenon as of the late 1960s, especially when it came to Mandarin films being made in Taiwan. Most of it was being done through the CMPC, right? So this kind of break into private venture is relatively new. And the kind of low-budget film sound process shown in the film, depicted there, was more typical of Taiyu Pian from early on. But by the mid to late 1970s, of course, there are not so many Taiyu Pian anymore. And these practices had become quite popular in the privately funded Mandarin films as well. So you see, it's like a Hong Kong financed company, DE 公司, but in actuality, it was quite active in making films in Taiwan. Now, I want to emphasize that this is a kind of crossover project between Taiyu and Mandarin film, not just in terms of production elements, but in terms of comedy aesthetic. First, the film features comedian Xu Buliao, or Ko Weiliao, who was known for his Taiyu entertainment persona. Despite the fact he mostly performed in film and television in Mandarin, we might even say his success was partly based on his loving caricature of the Taiyu speaker, though he was also a very talented comic magician and stage performer. Xu was quite capable of doing comedy through vocal tricks in his stage performances and brought some vestiges of this into his film work. His post-production vocal antics, however, were amplified by comedic Foley art that made him an object of sonic absurdism, as if the wild and incongruous sounds emanated from his visually comedic body. This comedy can only be achieved through so-called dubbing. Right? So dubbing kind of like sounds of metal and wood and cans kind of bouncing around to him being hit or falling down and that sort of thing. On top of the comedy surrounding Xu, the presence of Sanfang Recording Studio also quite naturally brings attention to the acousmet in cinematic experience. In fact, it offers a kind of operational aesthetic, which Tom Gunning first identified in the early silent comedy gag. That is, the comedy comes from a mechanical device, here the fact of dubbing, and the audience becomes privy to the workings of this mechanical device because we're shown scenes of it happening. And either the functioning or malfunctioning of the device is the source of comedic surprise and delight. On top of this operational aesthetic, the acousmatic effect of the telephone is exploited for a romantic comedy subplot. Two young people who are at opposite ends of an ongoing phone argument within this building fall in love when they have in-person dates before realizing the identity of the other telephonic voice. So they just don't know that they've been arguing with each other the whole time on the telephone. This rather classic gag of misidentification based on telephonic acousmet, paired with an equally classic romantic comedy trope, draws attention to the artifice of recorded or transmitted sound, just like in the scenes that demonstrate Foley art and dialogue recording sessions in action. So all in all, I want to make the argument that the film is highly conscious of the gap between sound and image, but instead of showing it as a lack or a failing of Taiwan cinema, it transforms the gap, or the bad dubbing, into a deliberate and even ornate kind of comic attraction. And if we have time later, I will show some clips, but just to kind of give you an idea, in this scene, they're doing a lot of hammering and building, and there's a lot of noise coming from Xu Wuli's body. And in this scene, he kind of shows off his vocal tricks, his kouji, but you have to understand that he recorded them later in the recording studio to match his visual performance, right? Here is a demonstration of the operational aesthetic, where you see a rather funny scene of the dialogue recording working and not working. This is the romantic comedy subplot where they're calling each other and then dating in person without really understanding what's happening. And then finally, I have a clip. If we have time later, we can call it back. This is when neighbors downstairs are fighting with the sound studio, and because they object to the noise the sound studio is making. So they're making noise back, making it impossible for them to actually record film sound. A Foley scene, as you can see here. So in conclusion, I want to make the argument, Upstairs and Downstairs shows us that post-synchronized cinema in the 1970s Taiwan was well aware of a tension with sonic naturalism. It reveals the apparatus and spatial embeddedness of the post-synchronization process in urban Taipei, repackaging it not as a technological state of lack, but as a comic attraction. The path of noise reduction and sonic naturalism was not the only path, nor the most natural, if we look beyond the new wave to popular cinema. And in future work, I'd love to trace this through a lot of other film sound practices going through Hong Kong with Cantonese film, and going into the 80s and 90s. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. And so now we have our final presenter, Xie Xinqin. Professor Xie is Associate Professor at Graduate Institute of Taiwanese Culture at the National Taipei University of Education in Taiwan. And she will also be joining us virtually.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Xinqing Xie from National Taipei University of Education. The paper I present today is titled as Migration State in the Making, Biopolitics, Public Discourse and Documentary Filmmaking on Migrant Workers in Taiwan. As everyone knows, migrant workers have become a major source of inbound migration to Taiwan since the 1990s. Along with the growing population of migrant workers, some filmmakers embark on their journeys of shooting migrant workers and exploring their living and work experience to give voice to the voiceless in the mainstream media. Some documentaries produced by groups of activist-oriented filmmakers delve into social structures and convey clear political messages for advocating legal reform for migrant workers' rights. Other documentaries adopt humanitarian perspective and focus on individual migrant workers to explore how they work, live, and survive in Taiwan while maintaining an intimate bond with their family in the homeland. With these directors' efforts of long-term film work and filmmaking, the cinematic representation of migrant workers in contemporary documentaries is key to understand the relation between transnational migration and cultural production. This paper looks at the latest work on the topic to investigate how biopolitics has been exercised and addressed. Inspired by the concept of precarious life coined by Judith Butler, this paper examines how the bodies of undocumented migrant workers have become wounded, precarious, and ungrievable as represented in The Lucky Woman. In addition to the textual analysis, the film's circulation and reception by the audience in post-screening sessions merits exploration to understand the formation of public sphere in relation to the migration issue in contemporary Taiwanese society. The case study I'm analyzing in this paper is The Lucky Woman, directed by Zheng Wen-zhen. It centralized its narrative on two undocumented Vietnamese migrant workers, Phan Xio Van and Chen Ding-hong, to tease out why and how they become the so-called runaway migrant workers and how they survived before being repatriated back to Vietnam. The first film subject is Phan Xio Van, a female Vietnamese migrant worker. She has experienced sexual harassment by her former employer and occupational injury in the workplace. At the beginning of the film, the director uses medium shot to portray the constraint of Phan's body, as you can see from the 4 screenshots. With the frames of an iron window, the scene showcases Phan is unable to leave her employer's house and take leave with any freedom. The director also adapts the physical framing of the migrant worker's body with a medium shot to indicate the precarious state of her life, owing to multiple forces from the employer, agents, governments, and labor markets. The documentary includes several scenes to depict these film subjects' despair when they are sick or encounter incidents of occupational injury. In Chen's case, his finger was cut off while working in a factory. After the incident, Chen suffered dual torments from his physical wound and being laid off. Being an undocumented migrant worker in Taiwan landed Chen in an unsafe and unsupported situation. Another undocumented migrant worker's occupational injury case is also presented in the film. Wen Jing-san's whole body got burned severely in a car accident at work, as you can see from the right screenshot. The shot clearly portrays the severe injury that leads to Wen's despair. The incident not only caused Wen's physical injury, but also created financial difficulties for him. However, his employer refuses to take any responsibility of the incident or provide compensation. These three cases addressed in the documentary showcase that undocumented migrant workers have been trapped into multiple difficulties without any financial and social support and become ungripable, precarious subjects who have been neglected in Taiwanese society for a long time. Several scenes in the film show fans busy with visiting wounded Vietnamese people and arranging funerals for Vietnamese workers who passed away in an accident in Taiwan, as you can see from the left screenshot. Fans' active participation in social media and activities for public welfare show her strong vitality to fight her fate. It demonstrates a form of grassroots and bottom-up resistance against the unequal treatment and imperfect immigration law. The other major film subject, Chen, is passionate about painting to make a record of the experience of migrant workers in Taiwan. The film is segmented into 6 sub-themes: escape, painting, dream, disaster, go home, 4,094 days, to elucidate key incidents that both film subjects had encountered while working as migrant workers in Taiwan. His painting explicitly embodies his emotion, observation, and reflection on the lived experience of migrant workers, and delivers clear messages for audience to feel the pain, suffer, and struggle of migrant workers. Biopolitics as a theme of the documentary has been explored with the focus of the film subject's bodily wound resulting from undocumented status, imperfect regulation of employment, marginalization, and exclusion from the society. However, under the precarious condition, these film subjects retain agency to fight against the oppression. Fans' social participation and Chen's painting both demonstrate multi-forms of resistance that reconfirm them as humans beyond being workers. Documentary making visualizes issues related to migrant workers and opens a space for its audience to reach a further understanding of their experience and predicaments in Taiwan. To further understand the audience reaction, we can take a look of what types of topics have been discussed and how the public sphere has been formed in post-screen session. As undocumented migrant workers are the key focus of the Lucky Woman, the most frequently raised question is whether the director violated any laws to film the undocumented migrant workers or help them in an illegal situation. It is a common misunderstanding that undocumented migrant workers are illegal and breaking a criminal law. In fact, they only violate the administrative law and are unable to work and stay in Taiwan legally. Therefore, post-screening Q&A sessions with filmmakers are an important forum to clarify such misunderstandings. The director Zheng Wenzhen responded to the above-mentioned questions in Q&A sessions and made an additional remark. She would stop filming and would not release the film until all the film subjects leave Taiwan. It confronts to the ethic responsibility of the director to protect her film subjects in documentary filmmaking. The post-screen session can be regarded as a form of public sphere defined by Habermas. This concept suggests that the formation of public opinions in the public sphere is important and bridges the state and the society. Inspired by the idea, I also use the concept to investigate what types of public opinions are generated after the participants watch the film. as the documentary acts as catalyst for generating public opinion. What was included, focused, and shot in the film is key. In The Lucky Woman, the doctor followed Chen to the dormitory where he stayed before. The camera shows that the dormitory is located in the basement without any window and is simple and crude. It reveals migrant workers' poor living conditions that are not well arranged by their employers. In an online post-screening session hosted by Academia Sinica in July last year, right after an incident of migrant workers' COVID-19 cluster infection in an electronics factory in Miaoli, Taiwan. The issue of migrant workers' dormitory and their management was addressed. The director particularly focused on the issue in her talk and indicated concern regarding migrant workers' safety in the workplace and in everyday life while shooting the film. The discussion between the filmmaker and the audience successfully interweaves what is represented in the documentary into what is happening in the world. On the one hand, visible problems migrant workers have faced, including inhuman and degrading treatment, occupational injury, and dehumanizing living conditions. On the other hand, the film screening and post-screening discussion provide the participants an opportunity to share opinions and discover more about undocumented migrant workers. However, documentary of such ignore issues and their showing have limitation of circulation and distribution. Attracting more viewers for documentaries on migrant workers is a formidable task. In other words, civic consciousness and public opinion evoked through the circulation and viewing of the film exists only within its own echo chamber. Overcoming this limitation is a challenge for documentarians and activists associated with migrant workers. To sum up my presentation, this paper argues that documentary making is a means of intervention in Taiwan, which is a migration state with inbound migration, particularly from Southeast Asia countries under the new southbound policy. As documentary making intervenes in the representation of migrant workers in the mass media and the discourse of nation-building projects by the government, this paper proposed that the intervention takes place in at least 4 aspects. First, migrant workers' presence and participation in the filmmaking contributes to their visibility as they speak up for themselves on screen. It challenges what has been represented and reported superficially in the mass media. Second, Taiwanese filmmakers make efforts to represent undocumented migrant workers' precarious lives, unmask their sufferings, and call the audience attention to the imperfect employment system that leads to the dehumanizing living condition they have experienced. Third, post-screening sessions contribute to the formation of public opinions that demonstrate increasing civic consciousness toward the issue of migrant workers. The formation of public discourse by filmmaking, showing, and discussion is necessary to intervene in the migration state. Finally, structural problems of the employment system and policy making cause the state of precarity for migrant workers. These 4 aspects contribute to gradually intervening in the migration state of Taiwan. Thank you so much for your listening.
So now we're entering to our Q&A session. I would like to invite our 2 panelists to the front, and we will also pull up our virtual presenters. Are we missing Evan? So we're going to open the floor to our yeah. And is it okay that I just have you over here so that everyone can, instead of having me repeating your question? Okay, thank you.
So first of all, I would like to thank you all four presenters for your fascinating presentations. I've learned tremendously from all the four papers, and I have a question specifically for Yiling. So, yeah, I really appreciate the ways in which you really delineate the kind of reception history of the film Bicycle Thieves, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the issues of cultural hierarchy and genre, which I believe you have actually touched upon a bit in your presentation. So, what you said in your presentation really reminds me a lot about the kind of mediated trajectory of literary modernism in East Asia. So instead of like a wholesale appropriation of literary conventions, it's actually a very mediated and selective process. And so I think in your presentation you mentioned that, was it the distributors or the media, like they were a bit undecisive about how to categorize the film Bicycle Thieves, like whether it belongs to 文艺片 or romantic comedy or like a social educational film. And in your conclusion, you actually like pointed out the kind of divide between the commercial versus the commercial or the governmental like reception versus the critical reception of the film. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how the film Bicycle Thieves has sort of undergone a kind of transition in terms of the audience perception of the film, because nowadays when we talk about this film, we don't usually think of it as a popular or commercial film, and then instead we will talk about it as a kind of art house work. Yeah, I hope my question kind of makes sense. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So I think the question is related to how the different receptions of the film throughout. So one thing I find it interesting. So I think it's a big question. And especially the related question of the cultural hierarchy of the genres. My intuition now is want to say the film distributors will just assume Western film and these kind of films who are award winning belongs to the high cultural realm. But that just I'm just speaking on it. This is just my intuition. I need to read more about their either trade press or other material to really determine that. But one thing that I find it interesting is the idea you touch upon is this strange thing of how to categorize a film. I just want to give an example. It's like Bicycle Thieves, when a distributor first submitted a film, they in the genre section they wrote down 现代人情剧. So I guess modern human drama is the term. And I think in that file it got crossed out. And later, several years later, another distributor submitted that film, and they changed the genre to like social educational. So it is those like strange moments of undecisiveness, either on the distributor side or on the governmental side, just indicate something about either that film is just hard to categorize, or the commercial parts and the government they are still struggling with like how to define these things. And I'm trying to figure out like what's the principles behind those classification. Like when Yi seems to base on like cultural value and social with Western arts, but if you think about romantic drama, it seems to relate to plot and genre. And if you think about social education, it's about the social function of the film. So it seems like the reasoning behind that categorization are also quite diverse. Sorry, I probably took out too much time.
Hi, so thank you all for presenters for this really like inspiring discussion that you all brought up. And I actually have like questions for each presenter. So if you don't mind, can I just like briefly go through them? So for Viola, I'm actually like really inspired by the piece you show, and this is probably a bit tangential to your research, but then because like in Korea, the DMZ, they also have those like huge stereo systems, and I'm just curious, like how is there any like similarities or connections between the one in Jingmen or the art piece, the installation you show, and what is currently used in the DMZ area? And for Yiling, because I think that's probably like another part of your dissertation, but can you just kind of elaborate more on how this Italian neorealist films and the relationship or influence on the new Taiwan cinema, like how this genealogy or trajectory goes? And for Dr. Shi, this is also a little bit probably a little bit tangential to your research or beyond the scope of your research, but I'm just curious about like, is this kind of like on-site recording, does it influence the acting style or the training and acting? Because that's definitely very different from like dubbing, and then you have to act it out with your voice. And my last question for Dr. Xie is that you mentioned, which I really appreciate, you mentioned that with those films, they would not release it until the undocumented migrant workers left the country to just protect them. But my question would be like how this would then be a kind of like time disparity between when the film was recorded and when it was released, and we held the post-screening discussion, and how do we kind of like mind that gap, especially that you mentioned during the COVID time, there's like a clusters of positive cases, and these are definitely not the case when the films were filmed. So like what's the kind of like connection, and how do we kind of see the conversation going on between? Thank you.
Yeah, and no worries. And thanks, Zihan. It's like a brilliant question, and I think you already recognize for the mediation of female voice is not really a local. It's both a local specific issue, but it's also sort of like universal in some way, as you can see from the Korean example. So one thing I can say, but it's really I have to say it's like a very conventional thing. But I do think the case in Korea is somehow I guess it would be great to do a comparison or also like a reflection to the situation between Taiwan and the Chinese community. So one thing I can say is that I sense there was a sensing. There was using like a female popular singer, and in contrast to like a social realism, so like a communist side. But the other thing is that I think the more interesting way to see this kind of share in common for they all use operationalize or instrumentalize a female voice is that how they believe that female voice is sensible enough to be a mediation between two ideology. So I think that's the thing I'm interested in, and I believe some of my friends, they are working for like Second World War, the East and West Germany. So they are also have this kind of, but they were using radio program. So I do think it's a topic that was like investigating. So if you are interested, we can definitely talk more after
that. So the relationship between neorealism and New Taiwan cinema. So I think the common conclusion among the scholars is, so New Taiwan cinema, especially Hou Xiaoxian's films, they use a lot of non-professional actors, which is the case, which is also the case in Bicycle Thieves as well, and on-location shooting. It's also the case in Hou Xiaoxian's work as well. And another example I really like is in 童年往事. So Time to Live, Time to Die. So there's a scene like where the oh sorry, it's the boys from 风柜来的人. So there's a scene where the protagonist hang out with his buddies, and they went to this local theater in Penghu, and they want to watch this foreign film because they want to see, because foreign film, they probably has more sexier content. So they went there and they watched, in the end, somehow they watched like Rocco and His Brothers. It's a film by Visconti. It's black and white. And it's this like film from the neorealist lineage. So this like intertextuality that's also embedded within New Taiwan cinema. Yeah, thank you.
I guess I can answer the question kind of piggybacking off of what Yiling was saying. But yeah, so I think that the immediate impact on acting style is that you can have unprofessional actors, right? Or non-professional actors, or people who are acting for the first time, and they can improvise. Especially there is this figure of Li Tianlu, the puppet master, who shows up in a lot of Hou Xiaoxun's films. And basically, you can just give him a very simple direction. He could just kind of improvise and run off at the mouth, and it gives that very sort of authentic flavor of a person in his generation, right? And that is difficult to script, right? And it's difficult to kind of repeat in the recording studio, right? So the on-site recording enables this kind of thing to happen. But if you might notice if you watch some of these films that in scenes where Li Tianlu speaks a lot, they will kind of show it from a far distance. Not only because it's part of the aesthetic to have these long shots, but also because you can't see very precisely what his mouth is doing, because sometimes they can't match it that precisely, right? Because of the problem of recording and then synchronizing it after the fact on a separate sound recorder. So yeah, I think that it does have that kind of influence upon the acting. And I would add to what Yiling just said is that I think I think that there is also in publications such as Wenji, right? So, people who are aware of culture and may have a more left-leaning perspective, they are not unaware of the message about class in a lot of Italian neorealism, and it becomes something that is discussed in those contexts by the intellectuals of that scene, right? So it does become like kind of absorbed into the cultural commentary in that way, and I think you can kind of trace that kind of intellectual history if you wanted to. All right, I'll stop there.
Hey, thank you so much, Zhihan, for your question. So, this for the Lucky Movement, it took 6 to 8 years for the director to shoot the film, and the director mentioned in an interview and saying that she kept asking herself when she should stop make the film, and I think for the whole throughout the production, the process of film production, she's more like a good company with her film subjects. For example, if she is not making a film, sometimes she helps the migrant workers to make appointment with the doctors, because once migrant workers become undocumented, they don't have health insurance. So they need to find a way to see a doctor if they are sick or they have some occupational injury. And for the situations that undocumented migrant workers have faced in the past decade or in the past 2 decades, I see some similar situations that are still happening and ongoing and unsolved. For example, the dormitory situation. So migrant workers live in a very small or crude dormitory, or they share space with others, and even they don't have their own private space when they work in the factory. So I think these situations are ongoing. So I think the release of the film are at a very good timing. So we can use this film to call more attention to these situations or problems or structural problems that undocumented migrant workers or documented migrant workers have been facing throughout of the years. Thank you so much for your question.
So, do we have more questions? We're actually almost it's almost towards the end of this session. But if everyone, there's coffee break afterwards. But if everyone is okay, so okay, if I ask the question, I'm gonna exercise my chairing power and also as an organizer to keep you here. But yeah, so So I think Eileen very aptly suggested in his presentation how the various modes of evaluation regime attempt to frame or regulate or contain that imaginative power that may emerge through the sensorial experience of watching Bicycle Thief. And I think to some certain degree, all of the presentation today on this panel implies some mode of imagination. And I'm using imagination as a very overgeneralized term because I'm trying to talk to all four of you at the same time. So imagining the viewers or the listener on the receiving end of the film production, the radio broadcast / the sound installation through the framing or the construction of the different modes of audio visual experiences. And I was wondering if it's possible for you to talk more about this kind of relationship from your perspective of your research or your presentation. Yeah, like how I guess how the producing and the receiving ends have some modes of imagination going on. It can be from the producing end to the receiving end or vice versa. Thank you.
I can make a preliminary answer to that, which is because I talked about two different sort of philosophies of sound design in my presentation. And I think if you're going for an aesthetic of sonic naturalism, right, what you're kind of imagining is that the viewer can kind of wander around, right? So they can kind of draw out from environmental sound what they want to focus on and to hear. It's the same thing with, the sort of Taiwan New Wave type of aesthetic, which is very slow, very long shots, very long takes, I should say. And then so your mind starts to wander and you can pick out what you want to notice. And the same thing with the sound, right? But whereas if you have a very precise idea for what should be synchronized to what, right? If your point is clarity, then you don't want the viewer or the listener to have that much budging room. You have to be very precise and clear. Like, this is the effect that I want, and this is what they will hear, right? So the goal of that kind of post-synchronization aesthetic is to have that sort of precise effectiveness. And in the kind of film that I showed, it's about entertainment, right? So the effect of being entertained by a kind of audiovisual joke. So you can see that it's a different kind of audience that it's looking for and projecting with these two different aesthetics.
I think this question is really interesting. No worries. Yeah, I appreciate this question, but I think I have two trajectory to talk about the word return imagination. Because first is that since I'm doing for this paper is more like sound study. So while I'm doing the writing process, I think because the artist when he wrote about the work description, she also used the term like imagination. But for me, this term is a little bit vague. And also on top of that, I think imagination is a visual term. So for what I'm trying to emphasize here is about the sound. And while on the other hand, I think Theodore, the notorious Theodore Adorno, he talks about how imagination and about the fetishism to radio user, especially like a radio ham. So I think imagination, there's actually it's a pseudo individualism that was provoked through the radio listening. So I do think imagination also related to the sound study, but I'm from like a really traditional background, but I do think there probably will be like a new article talking about imagination in a more positive way in sound studies. Yeah, thank you.
I guess I understand imagination in a relatively rudimentary way. So in my project, I'm thinking about just how people define cinema. So this is like a historical and cultural study way to answer like Bazan's question, what is cinema? And the idea is to look at different people from different backgrounds, how they imagine or plan or project what cinema should be. And I'm interested in the process and trying to figure out the logic, whether cultural or social or whatever behind it. So I guess that's how I approach imagination in this project, I guess. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Okay, so I think in my project, as for the audience viewing, I'm still conducting more interviews and also collecting more data to make a clear argument. So from the current finding, I find that if the audience have some background knowledge about migrant workers, they have some more imagination, or they can more like feel what's happening that is represented in the film. But for the general audience, they in the Q&A section, they probably didn't ask any question related to the documentary itself, but they would ask more questions about what's the situation or experience, or what's the society's reaction, or people's impression on undocumented migrant workers. So it's more like a sociology perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much all for answering my very vague questions. And I really appreciate how like imagination really comes together when we're talking about post-screening discussion, and like also at this panel, right? We all talk about and exchange that kind of like coming together and in imagining and experiencing those audiovisual. And we're doing this hybrid event, constructing a very different kind of audiovisual scape for a panel discussion and a lot of things. So final call for questions if we have any. Okay, otherwise, oh, yes, yeah, of course.
Thank you all for your presentation. I just have a little question for Dr. Xie. I was just wondering if you are going to, or have you already elaborate in your thesis that since you have you have emphasized the importance of revealing the situation of exploitation of employers in Taiwan. But since all the images finished at the end of the film were upon the consensus between the filmmaker and those workers, foreign workers. So I just wondering, for those moments that were not being filmed, and in which condition that the filmmaker himself or herself would stop filming if she thinks it's not allowed by the workers, or if it's not appropriate for the workers that she or he thinks that the situation is not something that he himself wants to be revealed, but maybe it's critical for the filmmakers to film. So I don't know how to reforming my questions, but my question was like, the film is always from the point of view of a filmmaker, but in the same time, it's the person who was filmed, even he's in a condition that is not comfortable, like the photos that you just mentioned just now, is a little bit like sloppy or messy. It's chaotic, is not comfortable from the point of view of outsiders like all of us, the audience. But from the point of view of the workers, are they themselves think that the condition is not so intolerable or is not so unreasonable for them? Or it's just the point of view of a filmmaker? I don't know if I make it clear or not. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. I think comparing with feature length film, documentary film always convey a message and a point of view of the filmmaker. So I didn't get any chance to interview the film subjects because they are in Vietnam now. And there's an exhibition happening at the Museum of Modern Art in Taipei recently. And the two film subjects were invited to attend a talk and or a round table for the exhibition, but because of COVID-19, they are unable to make it to Taiwan recently. So I didn't get a chance to interview the two film subjects. But for the filmmakers, because he had a lot, it took her 6 years to film the film, make the film. So she had a lot of footage to produce. And in an interview that I did with her 2 weeks ago, she said that actually she made two versions. The first one is very like activist oriented. So she added a lot of protest scene in her film. So she was planning to use the film to do more like activism or advocating like legal reform for migrant workers' rights. But eventually she decided not to put too many protest things in the film, and she tried to focus more on individual cases and experience of these two film subjects. So I think your question I need more like interview or find more evidence to see how the film subject's reaction to the film production. Thank you so much for your question.
Okay, thank you everyone for staying longer. Thank you so much again for to our panelists in person and also online. It's great to have you here. So let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Cool. Yeah, thank you.